You know, I wanted to start by reflecting on the brilliant presentation by Presidente Calderón and thinking about why is Cuba the first panel here at this conference on Latin America. This conference is also on U.S.-Latin America relations, and I think that's part of the answer. I mean, Cuba, in terms of the grand picture of Latin American economics and even global economics, is a very, very small piece of the story. But Cuba, from its history and its diplomatic position in the world, has positioned itself to be a much bigger story for Latin America and for the future of U.S. relations with Latin America as we look forward to the next Summit of the Americas in April of next year. As we've seen, there is some important maneuvering that's going on that relates to Cuba's role in the hemisphere, and an increasing sense that Cuba should be part of the larger inter-American family. And of course, there's a lot of tension around that idea, given the state of, as we saw from President Calderón's slides, the state of democracy and the rule of law in Cuba. So we'll be talking about that this afternoon. Let me introduce the panelists in the order in which I'm going to pose them questions. It's not necessarily the order in which they're sitting, and then we'll begin our conversation. I'm going to start with Juan Triana. Juan is a professor in the Centro de Estudios de la Economía Cubana at the University of Havana, where he teaches classes on the Cuban economy and universal economic thought. He has also consulted for companies in Cuba, in South Korea, and England. I think most recently even additional companies that are interested in doing business in Cuba, and is an award-winning economist in Cuba. I'm very happy that he's come here from Havana to join us today. I'll then turn to Augusto de la Torre, who is the chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. Has spent many years at the bank as a senior advisor there, and from 1993 to 1997 headed the Central Bank of Ecuador. I'll then turn to Richard Feinberg, who's a professor of international political economy at the University of California, San Diego. He once served as president of the Inter-American Dialogue, so he's in very familiar territory, and served many years in government, including during the Clinton administration as the senior director for Latin America at the National Security Council. Carlos Saladrigas is chairman and CEO of Regis HR Group, which is a professional employment organization. And before founding the company, he was chairman of Premier American Bank and co-founder and CEO of the Vincom Group, which was one of the largest Hispanic-owned companies in the United States. He, importantly for this conversation, currently serves as chair of the Cuba Study Group, which is a group of Cuban-American businessmen who have been thinking and working hard on how to improve U.S. relations with Cuba. And then I will turn to Jennifer McCoy to my left. Jennifer is director of the Americas program at the Carter Center and professor of political science at Georgia State University. Before becoming director, she served as a senior research associate there for 10 years. She also runs or leads a group of Friends of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which is very relevant to the discussion we'll be having today. So let me turn first to Juan. We're particularly interested in focusing this first round of questions on the state of the Cuban economy. And you know very well, and been studying it for some years, several years ago under President Raul Castro, the Cuban government adopted a set of reforms, the lineamientos, which have catalyzed new economic activity on the island and has created a lot of expectation about how Cuba's economic model may be changing. Can you give us a sense of how it's going, the economic reforms are going, and what do you see as the primary challenges facing the Cuban economy in the short to medium term?
I think it's better for me to speak in Spanish because my English is really bad and I'm not able to synthesize the ideas. So it's no matter for you, I began to speak in Spanish. It's okay?
The reforms and transformation with the lineamientos or the guidelines were approved back in 2011. And this is very interesting because we have just attended a conference where one of the basic ideas is that the more markets we have, the greater the growth and better it is all around for the countries. But history has not supported this very well. In the case of Cuba, it's very interesting. The proposals from President Raúl have opened up the economy as never before to different markets. We have 500,000 private ownership or owners in Cuba. Today we have a real estate market, which we did used to have. We have more open investments that we used to have a year and a half ago. However, if you see the numbers, the growth is not good. It is below all the other countries in the West. But we need other institutions. And this is the basic idea that I could bring here to you. The transformation is working. Many changes have taken place. Many measures have been taken. However, they are still not enough. We still need to have a group of significant institutions that are established to achieve development. We have changed, we have transformed the vision of the country, a country that says we are a nation, we want a prosperous, sustainable socialist society, but we still lack the institutions to achieve it. And I think we lack institutions for development. We have some, we need to improve those, and we need to create new ones. And we need to continue to work to increase competition in the country among all the sectors of the economy as never before. Cuba has different economic sectors. The state itself is transforming. There is a private sector that is growing, a sector of cooperatives that is growing as well. However, we still are lacking institutions, and this is my opinion. We lack the institutions so that the economy can progress more dynamically. Transformations have tried also to establish the appropriate legal framework to generate more trust and stability toward the future. Of course, there is a great deal to be done. We are learning as we walk this walk, and we have made progress. In my opinion, the major challenge for our economy today is going to be, in a few words, we should be able to establish and launch a program with a strategy toward development which be consistent and pragmatic enough in order that we can connect all the different sectors. And this is the short answer. To give you the long answer, I would require a whole term, a whole university term. We have all the different figures. We need so many things in Cuba for an investment. We need to improve the infrastructure. We also need a more open economy in terms of the foreign relations, etc. And we need so many different things, but the more significant challenges today, the monetary distortion that the Cuban economy has. There's no doubt about this. There is a 2,400% lag in our monetary rates. We have set a record in this 2,400%, 2,400% lag. Monetary lag, and we have all these things in the short term that need to happen, and a little in the more medium term, we should try to achieve policy changes so that we can better use the foreign savings that come from abroad. And I would add the need to create appropriate employment for highly skilled manpower. We have the creation of adequate jobs in an appropriate sector in Cuba. We see that in some sector, but we need it in many other sectors. And this is an overview, a bird's eye view.
Turn to Augusto about that question, since you've been thinking about it and writing about it. You've written that currency unification is not only one of the big unfinished pieces of the business of reform, but that it's going to have a huge impact, and there'll be winners and losers, no matter what option you choose in terms of how to unify Cuba's currency. Can you say a little bit more about that? How should the Cuban government, in your given all the experience you've had around the region, mitigate some of the upside and downside risks of whichever currency plan they choose, whether it's a big bang or something more gradual?
Thank you very much. As Juan says, the issue of dual currencies and the distortion that a multiple currency generates in Cuba is the big elephant in the macroeconomic house. And so whenever you have a big elephant in a crystal room, you want to make sure that you can get the elephant out without breaking too much of the crystal, and you want to make sure that the elephant doesn't kill you. So this is a major problem in Cuba. It's a problem that has enormous complications at the technical level, and it's an issue that has enormous complications at the political level. So at the behest of my friends at Brookings, I thought a little bit about this issue. And I have 2 or 3 things that I think are important to keep in mind when one tries to confront this incredibly difficult problem. The first thing to remember is that in Cuba, the dual exchange rate system, where you have a rate that exchanges 1-to-1 to the dollar and another one that is about 24 to the dollar, this dual exchange rate system essentially in Cuba is a system of subsidies and transfers. Failing to understand that is failing to understand the Cuban reality. So you have to start from the fact that it's essentially at the core of the exchange rate regime, what you have is a system of subsidies and transfers. Who gets the subsidy? Whoever gets a chance to buy a dollar paying by giving 1 peso. Who gets the tax? Whoever is forced to sell the dollar at 1-to-1 instead of 24-to-1. So you have very significant transfers of resources going from one sector of the economy to another sector of the economy. The government is in the middle, and the government uses the exchange rate regime as a system of tax collection and subsidy provision. This is crucial. So any possibility of getting out of the multiple exchange rate regime in Cuba requires a fiscal reform. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is that Cuba has the largest spread in history between the 2 exchange rates. 1-to-1, 24-to-1, that's 2,300%. I do not know of any other country that has started a unification process with a spread so large. To Cuba's advantage, it doesn't have a lot of inflation. So the trauma of unifying the exchange rate will be somewhat mitigated by the fact that inflation is low, but that's a big starting point. So one thinks how in the world you're going to get the elephant out of the crystal room. You have to think of something that by definition has to be gradual. If you try to do it in one swoop, the wealth transfers and the extraordinary windfalls would be so much that the system politically and economically will not be able to absorb. So you need something that allows you to distribute this pain over time. Of course, whenever you distribute pain over time, you create incentives of wait and see or time inconsistency. So it's not trivial to say that you need gradualism. You need gradualism, that's, I think, a right conclusion, but you have to be aware of the pitfalls of gradualism. The second is that you need to distribute the pain over time, but at the same time you want some gains to be happening as soon as possible, because the whole purpose of unification is to get better economic performance. However, you do not get the better economic performance immediately. So the improved economic performance, the better allocation of resources, the response of economic activity to the new unified exchange rate will only come gradually. So you have a lot of pain and gains that come over time. So how do you square the circle is the big challenge in Cuba. how can you make, ideally what you want is to distribute the pain exactly as the gains are coming up, so that one matches the other and the government can redistribute to soften the blow. That is difficult, it's almost impossible, but you have to think of something like that. So there are several ways you can think about this. At the one extreme would be the orthodox view, which I think would be suicidal, which would be, on day one, let's bring the exchange rate to 24-to-1, one exchange rate, and then we move on. I think that the shock to the system will be so harsh that the experiment, I'm sure, will not be sustainable. So at the other extreme, you have the idea of, let's do this very slowly. And let's do it sector by sector, so that the pain is really by drops. That helps from the point of view of distributing the pain, but it doesn't help too much in terms of getting the economic activity to respond to new relative prices fairly quickly. So my sense, and this is what we, with my co-author, we say in the paper that you asked us to write for Brookings, my sense is that you need to have something that is fast and something that's gradual. You know, in economics, there's this principle of marginal optimization, which I think makes sense. So you want something that quickly gives signals to producers, to consumers, so that they can start acting on the basis of new prices very quickly at the margin. So you can get some materialization of gains. On the other hand, you want to soften the pain. So my thought for our Cuban friends is to exactly go back to the idea that the exchange rate system in Cuba is a tax and subsidy system. So why don't you design a system where at the moment you unify, you create explicit subsidies and taxes that leave people exactly as they were before the unification. And use a system of what we economists call lump sum taxes or lump sum subsidies. So you give them this, so on day one, people are the same as before because they are getting the subsidy they were getting before, now explicitly, or they're paying the tax that they were paying before, now explicitly. So everything becomes transparent. You know which public enterprises get more subsidies. You know which public enterprises get less subsidies. You know who is taxed more and who is taxed less. So at the day one, everybody is left the same through a fiscal policy intervention. But then you unify immediately. So that from day one, the exchange rate's already giving the right signals. And at the margin, producers, consumers, investors start operating on the basis of a more realistic exchange rate, which is a key price in the economy. So my sense is that in order to get it right and balance appropriately the pain and the gain, you need gradualism. But ideally, it would be better to put the gradualism in slowly dismantling the taxes and subsidies and not in slowly adjusting the exchange rate. So that's very far from what the Cubans are doing. So I hope we keep on saying this because I think it's worth considering. What the Cuban government is doing is something that I think is going to be very difficult to implement, which is modify the exchange rates gradually, sector by sector. So some sector, like the sugar sector, gets a gradual adjustment, perhaps faster than the other sector. What that creates for me is incredible noise because it will create even more exchange rates. It will be even more difficult for the economy to adjust and to understand what the new prices are. So this gradual sector-by-sector approach, which I think is what's in the mind of the Cuban policymakers, seems to me is going to produce very prolonged pain, but very little gain.
And what role do you see, if any, for the World Bank and the IMF and the other international financial institutions, given that Cuba is not a member of them?
Well, I have two thoughts on that. One, that the process of currency unification, because it has so much shocking effects on wealth redistributions, would be much easier if there were international financing available. So from the point of view of Cuban welfare, it would be great if the process of unification is accompanied by financial support from the rest of the world. Unfortunately, the politics are not conducive at this stage for that to happen, except one thought that I always have, and I have mentioned this to my good friend Enrique Garcia. I think that Cuba should become a member of CAF tomorrow. I don't see any political obstacle to that. I don't see any technical obstacle to that. I think it's a win-win, and it would be an important signal to provide. And so I don't know whether I'm missing something, and I apologize for putting you on the spot on this one, but I do want to put you on the spot.
Enrique says they're working on it, which is we'll come back to that. I'm glad you raised that. Let me turn now to Richard and focus a little bit on some of the microeconomic changes that are happening on the island. You've done some interesting research for Brookings on the role of the cuenta propista sector and the emergence of the self-employed non-state sector that is getting involved in opening restaurants and small hotels out of their homes and construction and transportation, et cetera. The government has opened this sector in part to drive people off of the public payrolls and into other areas of the economy. Given the pace at which this is happening, do you think that they'll be able to meet those goals of continuing to shift people off the public payroll into the private sector?
All right, well, thanks, Ted. First, let me recognize my debt to Professor Juan Triana here, who's been my mentor in studying the Cuban economy, and I thank you very much. Of course, all errors are mine. With regard to the growth of the small-scale business in Cuba, I think it's important to recognize, as Juan did begin to mention, that a lot has happened. That the Cuba of today, the Cuban economy of today, is not at all what the Cuban economy was 5 or 10 years ago. There's registered 500,000 which is 10% of the workforce already in the small-scale sector. In addition, by various calculations, there's perhaps another 200,000 who are working full-time in the informal sector. Plus, you have about 500,000 people in the countryside that are private sector. Add to that all the people in the government who are still in the government drawing a salary, but what do they do in the evening and on the weekends? They work also in the private sector. If you add together all of that, that's about, it can be as many as 2 million Cubans, which would be up to 40% of the workforce has at least one foot in the private sector. So that's an economy already in transformation. All right, but is it transforming rapidly enough to give good jobs to all the people who have been feather-bedded in to the public sector over the years? And I think the answer to that is no, flat out no, at this time. All right, what would have to happen to more rapidly absorb people into decent jobs? Well, first, as it stands now, only about 200 categories of jobs are open to people who want to legally go into the private sector. And that excludes most people who have university educations. So if you're an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer, or an architect, you in Cuba today cannot open up your own private office. That could be changed overnight. So they could dramatically expand the types of people who can go into the private sector. Then they could try to make the immediate private sector environment more open and conducive. There are very, very few wholesale markets today. So if you're trying to sell a product or open up a store, you've got to go to retail outlets like any other Cuban, so it's much more expensive. If you want to rent space to open up an office or a retail outlet, it's very hard to find space, commercial space to rent in Cuba today. So there are some reforms that could be taken that are very specific to the small-scale private sector. The Cubans could allow the international community, which is interested, the Europeans have expressed an interest, if CAF is interested, to provide various forms of technical assistance, training, management assistance, and maybe even small-scale credits to this sector. The Cuban government, with the international agencies, could allow these companies, these emerging companies, to trade and import internationally on their own accounts, which they are not allowed to do today. They've got to go through big state-owned organizations. Ideally, the international financial institutions could engage, which would provide, of course, a lot more liquidity. In the area of tourism, where a lot of this is located, the tourism sector is growing but slowly, partly because there's a limited number of hotel spaces or beds in Cuba today, and that's because the government very closely watches the expansion of the hotel area. There are a lot of international hotel chains that are dying to invest in Cuba today, put in more beds, more tourism, more market for the small-scale sector. That's all being held up for various bureaucratic reasons in the interests of the military, et cetera. So there's a lot that could be done in that area. Then, of course, there's the broader issue of the Cuban economy as a whole, creating a business climate, and that involves, as Juan suggested, a whole series of reforms, including some of those that Augusto looked at. The last point I would make is the ideological one. The government has said, yes, the private sector is legitimate and important, but it still is maintaining, we are a socialist economy. And I think it's got to come to grips with the idea that it is moving towards a more hybrid, mixed economy, and that being in the private sector is fully legitimate, not second-class citizen. And they should be willing to say it's okay to start off as a small-scale firm, but what is the goal of every small-scale businessman? To become at least a middle-scale businessman, if not a big businessman. That's the whole idea. That is to say that capital accumulation is legitimate, and as the Chinese finally came to say, to be rich is glorious. And we need to hear that in Havana.
Well, I mean, there are some signs that wealth is growing in Cuba in certain sectors, and levels of inequality are growing as well. But there's another sector that the government has put a lot of effort into, which is the Port of Mariel, creating a special economic development zone and promulgating a new foreign investment law to kind of bring Cuba a little closer to international standards, given how uncompetitive it has been. Can you comment a little bit on the foreign investment law and whether you think it's on the right track?
Okay, yes, so earlier this year, the Cuban government announced actually two laws. One is for foreign investment as a whole, and the other is for foreign investment very specifically in this new free trade zone, which was built for the Cubans basically by the Brazilians. The law itself is reasonably by international standards. I'm sure the Cubans looked at all the laws that other countries have, and it more or less mirrors those laws. That's not where the problem has been. Because so far, the international response has been lukewarm at best. I would have thought that as they announced these new laws, that they would have more or less simultaneously announced some showcase investments. That has not happened. So where do the problems lie? Part of it is the bureaucratic approval process. Very, very slow. And this gets again to the ideological issue. Although, Raul and others have said we want foreign investment, it's not clear that everybody at senior positions in the Cuban government really wants significant foreign investment. So the signals are not clear throughout the whole bureaucracy, and that's really important, and that needs to change. Then it gets to this issue of costs, competitiveness. And I don't think the Cubans are used to thinking about competitiveness on a global economy. They're just not. So when they talk about wages and how the wages are set in Cuba, they're not thinking, okay, are we competitive with the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, or Costa Rica? And they need to learn to think in those terms. And then everything else that a foreign investment would look at, infrastructure, is there adequate energy? Internet connections. I mean, all of these issues, sort of have to be dealt with. So I think the issue of business climate, competitiveness, and ideological commitment to openness are all issues that need to be more adequately addressed if you're going to see significant foreign investment coming in.
Before I turn to Carlos and Jennifer, just staying on the economic theme, maybe I'll come back to you, Juan. Do you want to comment on some of these recommendations and observations?
No recommendation. Only one thing. Really, the new law is typical like other law in the world. And really, we have the bureaucracy is big in Cuba today. But at the same time, in the case of the special zone of development in Mariel, today we have more than 50, 60 companies trying to make some kind of business, and especially in some sector, very important sector for Cuba, like energy and biotech sector. And it's interesting. And I think in the next month, we can hope new news about this special zone.
And the visits of President Xi from China and President Putin of Russia, are these signals that there will be more investments coming from those countries?
In the case of China and Russia, yes. In the case of Russia, it's important because Russia is rediscovering Cuba today. And some special companies in special energy, but not only energy, is trying to make new business in Cuba. And everybody knows that we have a very special cultural relation with Russia in many years before. So I think it has sense to think Cuba is trying to relaunch the relationship. For Cuba, it's very important, not only by the debt. Russia pardoned 90% of the debt. With Cuba, it is important in terms of foreign currency for Cuba. But in the case of China, more than 30 new agreements were signed in Cuba in different areas, especially in energy. And it's important for Cuba too. And in order to rebuild some docks like Santiago de Cuba Harbor and Cienfuegos Harbor, it's important for Cuba.
So China and Russia are important but far away, and right next door you have the world's largest economy, the United States. So let me turn to Carlos and ask, you've been a leader in calling for change in U.S. policy that would allow greater people-to-people engagement and support to Cuba's budding private sector and the small entrepreneurs. President Obama did make some very important decisions in his first term that have allowed for increased contact and engagement and direct support from Cuban Americans to family back on the island, and this has had real tangible impact back in Cuba. Can you give us some thoughts about what impact do you think this has had, not only on the island, but also in public opinion in Florida and within the Cuban American community, and what steps should the president take next to build on that?
Ted, before I answer that, I wanted to highlight a misstatement in President Calderon's presentation. You noticed on the map how he shifted the map to show Mexico and displays Cuba as the center of the universe. That's absolutely wrong. The measures that President Obama took have had an enormous positive impact in Cuba. The most important impact that it has had has been people to people, family to family. It has had an enormous impact reunifying the Cuban nation that was deeply, and continues to be, deeply divided by politics, both on the island and in the diaspora outside of the island. Those measures also included significant lifting of the restrictions on remittances. And what that allowed to do is for the diaspora, mainly in the United States, but not exclusively in the United States, to send significant amount to Cuba, a good portion of which had historically and continues to be used for consumption, but a good amount of those remittances is shifted to capital investment in Cuba, to a great degree fueling the investment that has taken place in the small business sector. So those measures have had a tremendously positive impact. It has also had a major political impact in the United States, because by increasing the personal and familial ties of the Cuban family across the straits, it has also softened some of the more hardline attitudes that we have historically seen coming out of the diaspora in the South Florida area. And that has accounted for some of the political shift and the demographic shift that you have all seen in the polls that have been issued over the last few years. Biggest issue that's preventing this development continues to be, and I think you hit on it, Richard, ideology. The Cuban government continues to hold to this ideology of reforming socialism, which just simply will not work. And where we are seeing the impact of this ideology is as much as on the one hand, we see these small businesses want to develop, and we have some amazing people running these small companies. On the other hand, you have seen the impact of these latest custom regulations, and there it's like throwing a bucket of ice water on the surging economy of the small entrepreneurs, because a lot of the goods that they cannot find in Cuba, they have been importing from the United States and other places of the diaspora. So it is the schizophrenic nature of the Cuban government that does not provide a clear direction to either investors or small business people in Cuba or anyone else as to where things are going and how we're going to get there. It's a constant back and forth. It's a constant lack of clarity in terms of how we're going to do things. For instance, as part of the regulations, they decided, because they've done sector by sector, as you pointed out, they decided that they're going to privatize public toilets. Well, they issued a 23, I think it was, or 17-page set of regulations on how to regulate public toilets. So it is that overbearing intent to regulate and for the state to get involved in everything was just providing an enormous drag on economic growth. So once that begins to happen, we're going to see Cuba begin to take off in a significant way, albeit gradually. I don't think anyone is expecting or wants Cuba to do a big bang kind of change, but as long as this drag continues, it's going to be very, very difficult to see any significant amount of foreign investment or any significant expansion or growth of the small businesses in Cuba. We would like, and I was one of the signatories, along with Richard and others, that we sent a letter to President Obama asking him to do a phase 2 and open up the American market to small entrepreneurs in Cuba and to small businesses in Cuba, to begin to promote the further development of a civil society in Cuba, to begin to open up and make the changes that Cuba needs to make them easier. Because the more difficult we make those changes politically within Cuba, the more we're giving the upper hand to the hardliners within Cuba. Because those hardliners exist in Cuba just as they exist in Miami. So facilitating those in the Cuban government and those in Cuba that want Cuba to change and making it easier for change is, as I said during lunch, is probably the primary role of the international community and ought to be the primary goal of the United States policy towards Cuba.
Well, that's a great segue to my question for Jennifer. Jennifer, you spent many, many years working not only on Venezuela, but on how do you help countries in the region adhere to the Inter-American democratic standards that they've adopted. But the current climate in the region is really undermining consensus on those norms. And I'm wondering how you think about Cuba in that context. You know, Cuba's membership at the OAS, after being suspended many years, was lifted at the recent couple years ago, San Pedro Sula meeting of the General Assembly of the OAS. But Cuba has demonstrated no interest in taking the steps that would be needed to come closer to the OAS commitments. Now, next April, as I mentioned, the Summit of the Americas is upon us. What should Washington and the rest of the region do to bring Cuba closer to these hemispheric norms while still upholding them as credible commitments?
Well, Ted, it is a dilemma. It's definitely a dilemma. But there are three basic approaches that countries usually consider when thinking about how to promote human rights and democracy. One extreme are sanctions. A second alternative is trying to focus and capacity build and empower the domestic opposition to take action to change a government's policies. And the third is through engagement, providing incentives to a government and empowering the people themselves to promote the changes that the people want. A little bit more along the lines of what Carlos Saladrigas was just saying. The U.S. has been trying the first two for decades and has failed. Europe has recently decided to try the third option of engagement while recognizing human rights deficits. So we'll see the results of that. Latin America basically hasn't been doing anything, has been engaging certainly with Cuba, but not on this issue. So those are our options. The problem now that I see are two when you talk about the United States and you talk about the OAS, both you've asked about. The United States, in my view, doesn't have the credibility to lead on this issue in the hemisphere, and that's been our problem. Obama raised expectations tremendously in Trinidad and Tobago at the summit when he said, I'm going to engage, I'm going to talk with everybody, we're going to move forward. What Secretary Insulza said just a few minutes ago, we want to make policy with you instead of for you. But that hasn't happened on Cuba, and it also, I think, prevents the Latin Americans from taking action because it gets into the polarization in the hemisphere, but also the ideological issue at the hemisphere. The Latin Americans don't want to take a stand against Cuba when it is seen as still being imposed by the United States, even if they agreed in principle with democracy and the democratic charter and those principles. The credibility problem of the United States, I think, comes from the inconsistency in its approach to Cuba. If we're talking about bringing Cuba into the OAS, and part of that is a desire to sign the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, well, the United States and Canada have not approved or ratified that convention, along with some of the Caribbean countries. The state-sponsored terrorist list. Cuba is one of 4 countries still on that list. And if you read this past report that came out in April, the report applauded the role of Cuba in helping not only with ETA, but very especially with the FARC and the peace process in Colombia. Position that those 2 governments have said for a long time that Cuba has actually been helpful with those issues. So the only complaint left that I could see in that report was Cuba still harbors some fugitives from American justice for a long time. Yet, as Cuba points out, the U.S. harbors a fugitive from Cuban justice in Luis Posada, who had hijacked a Cuban airliner, according to many reports. Even on an international election observation, which is another point, which is a part of the Democratic Charter, calling for it, and the United States calls for it a lot in many countries, the United States doesn't allow it consistently in the United States or invite it. So these are the inconsistencies that make it difficult for the U.S. to take the leadership on this, or for the other countries in the region to follow. So what could the U.S. do? Could address some of those specific issues. Very easily, I think the state-sponsored terrorist list would be the first. But we've also got to recognize what you pointed out. Cuba has not exhibited interest in joining the OAS, and even in necessarily in restoring U.S. ties. What it's focused on is its own economic reforms, and really focused internally. I think that if we acknowledged the progress in economic freedoms and travel freedoms, which are crucial, that Cuba has made, and are tied and related to and may lead to political freedoms, that would be a first step as well, simply acknowledging the progress that has been made. The second may be the incentives we were talking about a minute ago. With the OAS, I believe, comes more access to the Inter-American Development Bank. So another multilateral that hadn't been mentioned in the discussion a few minutes ago. That might be an incentive in discussing that. But I think that if we can take more of the approach of engagement, we have more of the possibility of not only engaging along the lines that Carlos Saladrigas talked about with the people-to-people engagement, but also engaging the rest of the hemisphere in strengthening the norms across the board, across the region, rather than only singling out Cuba and trying to isolate Cuba, bringing it into a larger discussion. So I would recommend to President Obama to go to Panama, to go to the summit, to engage in a discussion. At the beginning, the summit did have the condition of democracy in the first summits. That is absolutely correct. Now, there needs to be a space for hemisphere-wide discussion on a number of issues. And we're in a position where it is the United States and to some degree Canada on one side still espousing the precondition to join the summit, and all of the rest of Latin America on the other side. And so I don't think it's going to happen that Cuba will be excluded from this next summit. And I think that the opportunity to begin a process of engagement is too important to lose. So I would recommend that he go, and that he use the last 2.5 years of his period to basically change an anachronistic policy and to engage and restore the credibility of the United States to lead on the human rights and democracy issues and try to bring the rest of Latin America along as well in espousing the norms of the Inter-American Democratic Charter even more strongly across the hemisphere.
You know, this is an important topic that maybe others want to comment on as well, but to throw another piece into this, don't forget that in addition to having the most comprehensive embargo on any country that the United States has on Cuba, it's codified by Congress, and Congress is also providing roughly $20 million a year in democracy assistance, which has gotten the United States into a lot of difficult situations. And so we have an American citizen in jail in Cuba, Alan Gross, that has become really the obstacle to much of any dialogue or cooperation between the United States and Cuba. But we also we hear in reports about fake Twitter efforts and sending Latin Americans to the island to try to inculcate some sense of opposition, albeit under a public health type of project. There are probably many more other projects like this. I wonder if, should the United States just somehow suspend all those kinds of activities until we get going this other engagement conversation? What do you all think?
Well, if you're talking about spending the $20 million a year that Congress authorizes, and that sort of the executive branch feels that it must spend, the Europeans do have regular foreign assistance programs in Cuba that have been relatively successful. UNDP has programs. Oxfam has programs. And these are the types of programs that the U.S. normally does on a worldwide basis. We support small-scale business. We support sustainable development. We work with countries on various social issues having to do with family planning, HIV/AIDS, gender issues. These are all the types of issues that, as I say, other donors work with Cuba. It's not easy, but they do it. And the United States could offer also to work in these areas in ways which would, and the reason we do these in many other countries is, aside from the merits of the programs, because they build up the fundamentals of civil society and the non-state sector. So all of these programs I just mentioned could also be justified as laying the groundwork for a more open society in Cuba. And so they would meet the goals set forth in the congressional legislation, but they would do so in a way which is less confrontational and, I would say, actually more effective.
Yo puedo hacer una anécdota personal, porque yo...
I would like to tell you a personal story because I had my own experience. In 1996, when the first changes began since the 90s, one of the basic ideas that Fidel Castro had at that point, our president, was to develop a non-state sector in our economy, one of small businesses, small enterprises. Now, for a number of reasons, I and my center ended up developing a project for development and training of small businessmen with seminars and a program of the European Union. And by chance, 6 months later, the Undersecretary of State of the United States for Cuba stated that the United States would use small businessmen to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. Can you imagine any president anywhere in the world, the most democratic one in the world, to admit or to accept that someone will use a project that he himself has launched to overthrow him? I think it would be unheard of. And that happened. It took us 20 years to relaunch the self-employment sector in Cuba. And I'm mentioning this because I believe that we have to understand the logic of the U.S. government, yes, but we also have to understand the logic of the Cuban government and people. For 50 years, it's been facing the first power in the world, which is only 90 miles away, and which has led to enormous costs for our country. Not only fines, even though President Obama's government has promoted people-to-people relations, but fines to foreign companies that trade with Cuba, well, Obama government has imposed over $2 billion in fines. And from the business world, the fact that the businesses really don't like this. When they hear that a new company has been fined, they are truly upset. I, as a consultant, have seen that businesses have to open up 7 accounts in different parts of the world to just have one business relationship with Cuba. So that has a high transaction cost. And Cuba is paying for that also systematically. And whether we like it or not, that has a negative impact on any attempt for change within the country. There's no other way to understand and do this, because whether we like it or not, the Cubans who live in Cuba, like me, every time we think about a measure, we always think of what will the U.S. government do to counteract this measure and to go against this measure. And now that we have launched more than 200 measures in Cuba to open the economy, give more space, more opportunity, with all the contradictions we may have within the island because of our political and ideological culture, still one of the great and large pressures that we are still facing and that prevent our transformation is this very non-rational behavior by the U.S. government towards what is happening in Cuba. We always ask, why Cuba and why not China? Why don't they behave that same way towards China? Why? In the final analysis, we are nothing. We're, yes, at the center of the universe, that's true, but we're such a tiny, tiny center that nobody can barely see us. We're not even 2 hours of trade of the U.S. with the world. Cuba is not a geopolitical threat to anyone.
So 50 years later, it's really hard for us to understand this irrational behavior. We're all genetically blockaded in Cuba, so we're not so really affected by this blockade. But economically speaking, the impact is strong because we're so close to the largest economy of the world. But now this is a very small economy, and a big part of foreign investments. That would be very impossible for us to do this in Cuba at this point in time. So it's really hard for us to understand what's being done in Cuba. And we ourselves are having a hard time understanding that. But given the systematically aggressive environment that has been, can move toward renewable energies. For example, using the sugarcane as a source of energy. There are many Chinese and Russian companies involved in this process, as well as solar energy as an alternative, because we have 12 hours of wonderful sun, especially in August. That's a gift of nature directly to us, and also wind energy and making use of that. So first we have to change the primary source of energy in our energy makeup, and also make the necessary technological changes to ensure greater efficiency, better turbines for oil and gas, which are being installed right now, because we still have to use those modes of energy. And 3, we have to, in addition to that, enhance and modernize the equipment, not only industrial equipment, but also domestic equipment used in Cuba, with greater usage of induction ovens, energy-saving light bulbs, and so forth. That could save us a lot of energy. That's being done. There is a program that's a 16-year program from here to 2020. I would prefer this program to end in 2020 so that I can get in on it and see some of the benefits from it. But given the financial circumstances of our country, it's really hard for us to take on any country to take on a deeper and more profound transformation than that which we are undergoing right now. Now, it's a very contradictory country, a very hot country, yet we don't always have hot water in August, nonetheless. And so we have to improve our heating capabilities, and that has to be made more efficient. Now, this is a program that's currently being carried out right now in our country. That's a reality. This is something that's been made public and publicly discussed on TV, and without a doubt, we have to seek out better rates. Not to punish people, but to encourage them, educate them, so that they only consume as much energy as they need. That is necessary.
The problem with Cuba is not in what they discuss and what they talk about. It's very simple. It's execution. They can seem to execute on anything they do, and nothing gets done in a way that is permanent, that produces the long-lasting results that you want. You know, I understand the energy concerns, that you have to look for other sources of energy. But, you know, being in the energy field myself, I understand that to have the cost of the fixed infrastructure in alternative energy, in addition to having the cost of your infrastructure in conventional combustion resources, because neither the sun, well, the sun doesn't do anything at night, you still need conventional things. It's how is the Cuban economy going to bear that cost? I think the first question that the Cuban economy needs to pose itself is how do we increase productivity? Day-to-day, ordinary productivity from people to people, from business to business, from enterprise to enterprise. And then all the other things, all those macro projects and so forth, those will come in time. But we need to have a relentless focus on the execution of productivity and productivity gains. And for that, the government needs to speed the pace of reform significantly, deepen the reforms, take a couple of sectors of the economy. If they want to remain in the state hand, that's fine, we'll deal with that later. But open up so that the creative juices of the Cuban people, the creative activities of the Cuban people can begin to generate wealth. Let the people go, in a sense, to generate wealth, to invest in their businesses. In many ways, this is exactly what happened in China. You know, a lot of people look at the Chinese model and they think the key success was government infrastructure spending. That was one factor. The key success is letting human creativity and human spirit go and do the investments they need to make, take the risks they need to take, and move the economy forward. And this is going to take a political willingness that the Cuban people and the Cuban government need to come to terms with, not because they're pushed by the United States, not because they're pushed by anybody else, but because they need to, because we have an incredibly talented human capital on the island, and they need to be let go to create wealth, create prosperity, and then the government needs to look at what they do in taxation and the things to prevent the resurgence of enormous inequality and other things. But productivity should be the bottom line of what needs to happen on the island.
The same thing say Raúl Castro.
Yeah.
I hear him. I will.
President. Productivity, productivity.
Perhaps two important points to add to the conversation here, which I think is fascinating. One, this focus on improving productivity has a huge amount of dimensions related to the business environment, quality of regulation, streamlining, rationalizing regulation. It has to do with private sector growth and so forth. It has a big microeconomic agenda.
Right.
What I want to make the point is that microeconomic agenda will go nowhere unless the macro picture is cleared. Let me give you an example. You can have a wonderful law on foreign investment. In fact, the foreign direct investment law is very decent. You're not going to get foreign direct investment because every foreign direct investor that comes to Cuba is going to be taxed by the exchange rate regime. He's going to be essentially dealing in businesses where the dollar that foreign direct investor brings can be translated into 1 peso. That makes Cuba completely uncompetitive. The labor costs that a foreign direct investor faces are not the true costs, because the government, the foreign direct investor pays salaries to the government at 1-to-1, and then the government pays salaries to the worker, and the worker gets a very small portion. So the foreign direct investor doesn't see the benefits of investing in Cuba from the point of view of the exchange rate. So as long as the exchange rate is distorted as it is, you can do all the micro reforms you want, and the system will be stuck. So this is a particular case, unlike other Latin American cases where the macro framework is already in good shape, you can do a lot of micro reforms. But while your macro framework is not in good shape, the micro reforms will give you no dividend. And that's an important, hugely important thing to remember. The other important thing to remember is, I think, is this, you know, I think Juan is absolutely right. There has to be a symmetry in which the international community treats Cuba. When the international community deals with Vietnam or Southeast Asia, there's an understanding that there's going to be a process of democratization and political progress, but that the economic progress is not held hostage to progress in the democratic agenda. In Cuba, we just turn things around, and we want, at least the United States seems to want, a regime change as a precondition to get economic progress going, which makes no sense. It's an unproductive approach. In the end, economic progress itself will generate juices for political transformation. So I think Juan is absolutely right. From the Cuban point of view, the Cubans must feel terribly mistreated because they are treated with not the same gauge with which other countries are treated.
And therein lies the irony of the embargo. You know, the embargo is the elephant in the room. Whether you become agnostic about it like Tom did or not, still the elephant in the room. It's still right there in the middle of the room. And what the embargo is doing, the worst thing about the embargo is that the more Cuba wants to change, the more it hurts, the more it penalizes Cuba. And that's why it's just an unreasonable and absolutely unproductive policy. But reality check is not something that it appears is going to go away anytime soon. So I think the Cuban people need to solve our own problems, dialogue, learn to talk to each other, and begin to move things forward. Because the political climate in Washington is as bad as I've ever seen it. And I don't think it's about to change in any significant way, save for what I think the president can do under executive authority. But the fact that it's made more difficult doesn't mean that Cuba cannot change. There are great opportunities for Cuba to move forward, and the Cuban people can do it. It just takes an awful lot of work.
Great. Well, now why don't we open the floor to some questions, and there'll be a microphone coming around. I see a hand over here. I want to take a couple of questions at the same time, and then I'll come over here. The gentleman down the aisle. Yep. Can you identify yourself and keep your comment or question short?
My name is Jose Miguel Pulido. I work at Mitsui & Co. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask more about the energy sector in Cuba. What role Russia and China are playing in it. I know you mentioned broadly that there are some infrastructural changes with clean tech, but I'd like to know how Russia and China affect that, and if other international partners are looking to get into Cuba's energy industry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And there's one other question on that aisle, and then I'll come over here. Go ahead.
Thanks. My name is Adrienne Pine. I'm at American University, and my question has to do with moving forward beyond 2015 to 2018, what you see happening with the end of the Castros in power, and who do you see coming to well, what do you see with that change?
Great. And then over here, this gentleman, yes. Over there.
Andrew Qualley, Sidley Austin, a lawyer. I'd like to tie in three technical points that have been made. Remittances, foreign exchange policy, and taxation. I think remittances are an enormously powerful source of microfinance. I assume that the remittances come in at the poor exchange rate, 1-to-1, or at least they are supposed to come in at that rate, so it's not very valuable. Second, the tax policy that you described, I think, is terrifically important. These are small steps that could have non-controversial, non-political, that could have an enormous impact. But I think to develop a system, and I'd like you to comment on this, develop a system whereby you are taxing the benefit, the subsidy that comes from a group going off of the bad exchange rate, the 1-to-24, and transferring that money to the one that is getting it at 1-to-1. Very complicated, requires sophisticated tax policy and implementation. And how would you do that? And maybe you could get some advisors in to help do that. It would have a terrific engine for growth on a very small basis.
Thank you. So on the energy question, there was a big effort by the Cubans to start exploring deep sea drilling a couple of years ago, with companies participating from India and Vietnam and Brazil and Russia, and all of those efforts came up dry. So the one oil rig, very specially built in Asia, because no more than 10% of the oil rig's materials could come from the United States because of our embargo, a very complicated long-term process to fit U.S. law to get this oil rig off to U.S. Cuba waters, resulted in dry wells. So Cuba seems to be now shifting more on other nearshore or onshore sources of drilling, and there does seem to be some interest by the Russians and Chinese in investing in that, but maybe you could elaborate on that point.
Well, in the case of onshore drill, Cuba has developed a horizontal onshore drill in order to get oil from 4 or 5 kilometers into the sea. Since onshore, Chinese companies, I think it's the most important partner in Cuba today to do something like that. Chinese company, not Russian company. In the case of Russian company, the Russian company said maybe 1 month ago that they are interested to begin again to drill not in the deep water, but in the sea in Cuba, very close of the shores. This is my information about. I don't have any more information.
Do you want to comment about what happens in 2018 when President Raul says he will step aside for new leadership?
We have another president.
Who will it be, and can you say a word about the transition that's already underway in the political leadership of the party and the government, with new faces, younger faces coming to manage different...
Yo pienso que no solo es un problema de
I don't think this is only a problem only that has to do with Raul not being the president after 2018. I think this has to do with new generations of future leaders in Cuba. There are new young leaders that we don't always see, but they are working on a daily basis in the provinces, in the cities. These are much younger people who are working every day, receiving training in the government and in levels of government, which is that much more difficult in the territories. We always hear about the national level governments, but the leaders at the local level have a harder time at it. We always talk about the development of a country, but when talking about developing a territory, a municipality, or a province, it's that much harder, because that person is held to account all the time by his voters. I think this is a milestone in Cuba, not only because Raul is the president, but if we look at the makeup now in government in Cuba relative to 50 years ago, there's been a complete turnover in key positions in the ministries, in very important businesses and agencies in the country. The leadership has undergone an entire complete turnover, and these are all young leaders. And one of the things that the government has tried to carry out is to create a national school that these young people go to study on a regular basis. Public administration, government sector, economy. This is a new phenomenon, and this has to do with the demographic challenge that we have right now in Cuba, because our population is getting ever older, and the Cubans of before are passing away. Well,
I would have thought that given the extreme energy dependency of Cuba, that over the last several years they would have been desperately looking for all sorts of investment in all sorts of types of energy. There are companies dying to invest in Cuban energy projects from Europe that have not been able to get the approval of the bureaucracy. China already has some onshore investments in energy, so that really would not be new. So I am not yet persuaded that there is the energy or the vision in the Cuban government to really move forward in an alternative energy project, as you see in other countries in the Caribbean basin where it is actually happening, so it can be done. So I remain skeptical until I actually see the projects on the ground. Maybe should I respond briefly to the tax issue? Sure. So on the taxes, there are a number of different types of taxes. On the remittances and on where the money is coming from for this small scale 500,000 entrepreneurs in Cuba today. And here I disagree just a little bit with Augusto's point that sort of, I don't know if you meant to say this exactly, but that nothing can happen until there are major macro reforms. Yeah, it would be tremendous if there would be an improvement in the macro position, but a lot is changing on the ground in Cuba today, and these 500,000 entrepreneurs are a big change. Where is their investment money coming from? We did a survey of some of them. About half of them have money coming from remittances. That would be to say mainly from the diaspora. Those monies enter on a one-to-one hard currency basis, so they are not taxed, and that is solid investment money. And then the other funds come from savings. That comes from all sorts of different sources. Selling a car, having been a diplomat abroad and you save some money, etc. So there are various sources of capital that are being used. Now, taxes on that small-scale sector look high by the numbers, but what happens? Since there are no computers really in Cuba, there's no real reporting system, the small-scale enterprise dramatically underreports revenues, so that the effective tax rate is actually quite modest, okay? So that's why they're actually doing very well, and in fact, a lot of them have very high profit margins. Thank you very much. Well, the problem on taxation is in the foreign sector, that is to say the foreign direct investors. There they are paying a very, very high, I think the highest labor tax in the world, of something like 900%, and that's what hurts competitiveness, no? If I could just take a real quick crack on Cuba in the future. Sure. Of course, nobody knows the future, but one can imagine different scenarios. U.S. policy has long been driven on the idea of regime collapse and sudden transformation post-Castro into a dramatically new pluralistic democracy. That's been the basic thrust of U.S. policy. What's the probability of that? We don't know, but I think what Juan suggested is probably the more likely future, which is to say an institutionalized Communist Party with another generation gradually coming in at all levels. If that's the case, U.S. policy is out at sea. We haven't even begun to think about how to engage with that institutionalized Communist Party. And that's where I think what a lot of us are trying to get at in the panel is, if we want a soft landing towards a more hybrid, mixed system, that gradually over time, when you do that first in the economic area where you have some opening and leverage, over time that is likely to produce a more open political society. And that, by the way, is the vision that drives American foreign policy everywhere else in the world, except on our beloved island of Cuba.
I want to say once more. In my personal opinion, this is the first time that Cuba has his own agenda, internal agenda, with or without United States. And I am convinced that in the future we go forward with this agenda, with or without United States. In the last 50 years, we learned to live without United States. And the new generation maybe have to learn to live again without United States. The problem is that the world has been changed. United States is not the same country that 50 years ago, because the world is not the same. The globalization is an opportunity for the whole country and for Cuba too. And it is something new in this relation. For Cuba it's important, really important, to normalize this relation. But today we have an agenda. And it's the first time that the government prioritizes the internal problem before the problem with the United States. And it is important for today and for tomorrow in order to understand what is the future of this relationship.
Augusto, on the tax issue?
Yeah, just one issue, the tax, and I want to follow up on what Juan says. I think he's absolutely right. My visits to Cuba have given me a conviction that the current attitude in the government is, let us no longer blame the embargo, and let's see what we can fix internally. Let's hope that the embargo changes. Let's hope that there's some rationality outside, but as far as Cuba is concerned, let's stop blaming the embargo. Let's try to fix things. Now, let's disagree a little bit more between us, Richard. I fully agree that there's a lot of things happening with the micro level, but I want to alert you to understand that the distortion is so huge that what is not being captured is bigger than what's happening. Let me give you just a simple example. The tax and subsidy system embedded in the exchange rate nullifies all the gains that Cuba could have from human capital. Cuba has a very high human capital, has excellent doctors, excellent teachers, better than many countries in Latin America. But a doctor in Cuba can do 3 times, 4 times, 5 times what he earns in a month in one day driving a taxi. Driving a taxi because you can get access to that exchange rate that is so good. So what you have is a huge divergence between the individual interest and the social interest. Society would like to use the doctor in doctor-like tasks, not as a taxi driver. The exchange rate system creates an incentive for the doctor to become a taxi driver. Society loses, the doctor loses, everybody loses because of this huge distortion. Think of all of your small businesses. Those small businesses, because of the exchange regime, cannot buy inputs. So when they visit Miami, they go shopping quickly to see if they can get the best machine for the beauty parlor or for the restaurant because they don't have access to the foreign exchange to buy the input. So the input market is really lousy for these small entrepreneurs. And this input market is lousy because behind that you have this crazy exchange rate regime that it is very difficult to dismantle. Now, to dismantle the exchange rate regime, and then I want to insist on that, you need a tax system that replaces that. And you have to do the 2 things together. My sense is that that is not sufficiently understood in Cuba. If you don't see exiting from this macro nightmare, which is the exchange rate regime, without introducing a modern tax system, you're going to be stuck there. So my point is, of course, many little things are happening on micro level, and they have to be welcome. But what is left on the table is much more than what you see on the table because of these very large, all-encompassing distortions. Why is it that a foreign investor cannot hire a Cuban worker directly? The foreign direct investor has to go to the employment agency of the government and pay wages to that employment agency, and the worker receives very little of that wages. Why is it that you cannot allow more direct contracting between the foreign direct investor and the so many talented Cubans that are very willing to work for a foreign direct investment company? So in the end, what happens is that Cuba has the largest labor tax in the planet because the employment agency of the government gets $1 and it pays about one fraction, very small fraction of that to the worker, 5 cents. So in this sense, the taxation is out of every dollar, 95 cents is taken out, and the worker receives little. So in some sense, in Cuba, some workers say, and Richard has quoted this, it is not that the whole thing is on the shoulders of the state. The ones that carry the load of the Cuban distortions are the workers. They are being taxed more than in any country in the planet.
So we only have 1 minute left. I know I'm getting signaled. So one final word from Jennifer and then Carlos.
Yeah, I have heard President Raul Castro say that he believed it was up to his generation, the first revolutionary generation, to start the changes and the reforms. and then it would go to the next generation. And that's when he initiated the term limits. And so I agree with the perspective that it's going to be a gradual change, and we've seen it initiated. We've certainly seen the economic reforms initiated. However, one thing I haven't heard much about, except a brief comment from Juan, is that there are, well, I want to say, I do agree too with Juan that they're very, as I said, they're very focused on their own agenda, much more than worrying about the United States. That's been my impression over these last 4 or 5 years. But there's one thing that is still very important to them and to the economy that you guys haven't discussed, the economists, and that are the financial restrictions, the financial transaction restrictions that are extremely important, and the banking issue that you mentioned, Juan. And that does result back to U.S. policy. Now, for those who still want to continue strangling the economy, that's fine. But for those, as most of this panel, who is talking about reviving the economy, then that is a serious constraint. And this is where President Obama can do at least one thing on his own, which is the one I mentioned, the state-sponsored terrorist list. That's only one of many U.S. laws and regulations that affect the financial transactions, but it is one that he can waive that, showing the progress that has been made. And that was my point.
Okay, great. Carlos, 30 seconds.
No, three hopes. Let's hope President Obama does take step number 2, which includes reestablishing diplomatic relations with Cuba, opening up to small businesses, civil society. Let's hope that the international community begins to provide a more enabling environment for Cuba to change, including perhaps assistance to do all the difficult macroeconomic reforms that Cuba needs to do. And let's hope that we Cubans learn how to talk to each other. It has been difficult. It's difficult in Miami to talk to each other. It's difficult across the Florida Strait to talk to each other. We need to do that. Cuba needs the diaspora, and the diaspora needs Cuba. Let's work on that.
Great. On that note, thank the panel.